In the summer of 1940, the United States Army was staring at its own extinction. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's blitzkrieg had erased entire nations. Poland, Denmark, Norway, France. The Wehrmacht's panzers were moving with a speed the world had never seen, supported by motorized infantry that struck like lightning. And in Washington, D.C., America's top generals looked at their own forces, and they were terrified. The U.S. Army was an antique, a relic from the last war. While Germany deployed mechanized divisions, America was still training cavalry regiments with horses. Its primary fast recon vehicle was the motorcycle, a machine that was useless in mud, useless in snow, and a death trap under fire. The Army had one fatal problem that was guaranteeing defeat in the next war. It had no way to move its men. It had no vehicle that could go anywhere, do anything, cross rivers, climb mountains, and survive the battlefield. The High Command knew that if America was dragged into this war, its soldiers would be slaughtered. They would be cavalry charging into machine guns. They would be motorcyclists stuck in the mud, waiting to be captured. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps did the only thing it could. It sent out an impossible request to 135 American manufacturers. The request was for a fantasy, a miracle car. The specs were insane. It had to be four-wheel drive. It had to weigh less than 1/300 pounds. It had to carry 600 pounds. It had to have a wheelbase of 75 inches. And it had to be delivered. A working prototype. In 49 days. The giants of the auto industry, Ford and Willys Overland, received the request. The response from their engineering departments was universal. Laughter, then rejection. 49 days? It was impossible. It was madness. Designing a new car from a blank sheet of paper took 2 years, not 49 days. The Army's request was a joke. Ford didn't formally reply. Willys asked for an extension, admitting they couldn't meet the deadline. The system had failed. The problem was unsolvable. Companies said no, but 2 said maybe. One of them was a tiny, forgotten company in Butler, Pennsylvania, that was already dead. American Bantam was bankrupt. Its factory floor was silent. Its workforce was gone. They were a ghost, waiting for the bank to auction off the machinery. They had no money. They had no engineers. They had nothing except desperation. On July the 17th, 1940, Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, did the only thing he could. He called a freelance engineer in Detroit named Karl Probst. He begged him to come to Butler to look at the impossible government contract. Probst knew the deadline. He knew Bantam had no money to pay him. He knew the giants like Ford had already walked away. He refused. Fenn called him again. He told Probst this wasn't just a contract. This was a national emergency. Probst finally agreed, telling Fenn he would come. But he would not take the job. He would just offer advice. Karl Probst arrived in Butler on July 19th. He was 56 years old. He was an ordinary man, a brilliant but broke designer, not a corporate executive. He sat in a room with the skeleton crew of Bantam. They told him the Army needed the first blueprints in 2 days. Probst looked at the specs. 300 pounds. Four-wheel drive. He knew instantly that the 2,300-pound limit was impossible. The axles alone would weigh too much. The Army didn't know what it was asking for. This was failure. This was a fantasy. Probst told Fenn he was leaving. He was driving back to Detroit, and then he didn't. Nobody knows exactly why he stayed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was patriotism. Maybe it was the look of desperation on the Bantam crew's faces. Karl Probst, an unemployed engineer, sat down at a drafting table in a bankrupt factory and did something that violated every rule of engineering, finance, and sanity. He took the job. He told Bantam he would work for free. For 5 straight days, Karl Probst never left the drafting room. He worked without sleep, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that the world was on fire. He was designing a car, the entire car, from his own imagination, from parts he hoped existed. He had to guess the weight of every single bolt, every bracket, every gear. He wasn't just an engineer. He was a mechanic, a designer, and an accountant all at once. And on the fifth day, he emerged. He had the complete blueprints for what would become the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC. But the blueprints, they were just paper. He had solved the problem, but only in theory. Now Bantam had to build it. They had 44 days left. A bankrupt company with a skeleton crew had to build a revolutionary, untested war machine from scratch, by hand. What happened in the next 44 days would change how every soldier in the world fought. But to understand the stakes, to understand why this stupid little car mattered, you have to understand what it was like to be a soldier before it existed. The first soldier, who died because he didn't have a Jeep, was Private William Hayes. November 1940, Louisiana maneuvers Hayes. Wasn't killed by a German bullet. He was killed by an umpire's flag. The Louisiana maneuvers were America's desperate attempt to see if its army could even fight. And it was a disaster. Hayes was a dispatch rider for the 1st Cavalry Division. His machine was the Harley-Davidson WLA. On paper, it was a fantastic motorcycle. Fast, rugged. On day 2 of the maneuvers, it rained. The fields of Louisiana turned into a thick, inescapable mud. Hayes's mission was simple: carry a message from Division HQ to a forward regiment. A 10-mile trip. He never made it. His motorcycle, weighing over 500 pounds, sank into the mud just 2 miles outside of camp. Hayes spent an hour trying to pull it free. The engine flooded. The chain snapped. He was covered, head to toe, in mud that felt like wet cement. An umpire from the Red Force, the designated enemy, found him sitting on the side of the road, exhausted, his motorcycle a useless piece of scrap metal. The umpire tapped him on the shoulder. "You're dead, son." Hayes had failed. The communication line was broken. The regiment never got the order to retreat. 2 hours later, the entire regiment was annihilated by the Red Force's armored units. The reports from the umpires were terrifying. Generals watched as their new mechanized units, their modified civilian trucks, got stuck in ditches. They watched motorcycles fail, one after another. They watched as the only units that could actually move through the terrain were the old horse-mounted cavalry. The generals were in a cold sweat. Their men were dying in practice because their machines couldn't handle mud. Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, an observer at the maneuvers, wrote a scathing report. He said the Army lacked a light, low-silhouette reconnaissance car that can go anywhere. He was describing a vehicle that did not exist. The second man to fail was Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was in charge of a .30 caliber machine gun squad. Their transport was a modified 1939 Chevrolet truck. It was just a civilian car, painted olive green. During a night exercise, Miller's truck was ordered to move to a new defensive position on a hill. But there was no road. The driver tried to take it cross-country. They made it 50 yards. The truck's chassis, designed for paved roads, got high-centered on a log. The wheels spun uselessly. The squad spent the next 3 hours trying to dig it out. By dawn, they were still there. The umpires ruled that a single enemy, Red Force mortar team, had spotted the stuck truck and killed the entire squad. The reports piled up. Officers radioing for support that never came. Artillery pieces stuck on gravel roads. Staff cars, getting flat tires and blocking the main line of advance. The 1940 Louisiana maneuvers were not a training exercise. They were a funeral. It was the death of the old American Army. The High Command knew with chilling certainty that if they sent this army to Europe, they would be sending thousands of boys, kids like Hayes and Miller, to their deaths. They were trapped. The giants of industry had said 49 days was impossible. The maneuvers proved that without this impossible car, America could not fight. The entire fate of the U.S. Army, its ability to even compete with Hitler, now rested on a tiny, bankrupt factory in Butler, Pennsylvania. Fraudulent, and a set of blueprints drawn for free by an engineer nobody had ever heard of. The clock was ticking. 44 days left. Back in Butler, Karl Probst and the Bantam factory manager, Harold Christ, began the real work. It was chaos. They had no parts. The Bantam factory was designed to build tiny civilian cars. It wasn't equipped for a rugged four-wheel drive military vehicle. They had to invent the supply chain as they went. Probst needed axles. He called Spicer Manufacturing. They told him they could design new axles in 12 weeks. Probst didn't have 12 weeks. He told them, "Don't design anything. Just use what you have. Use your standard car axles. We'll make them work." He needed a transmission. He grabbed one from a Studebaker Champion. He needed a transfer case. He called Spicer again. The Bantam factory itself became a legend in the town of Butler. The company president, Frank Fenn, put out a call. He told the town that Bantam was building a secret weapon for the Army. The factory lights, which had been dark for months, suddenly burned 24 hours a day. Welders who had been laid off for 6 months showed up at the factory door, tool belts in hand. They worked for IOUs, mechanics, sheet metal workers, painters. The ghosts of Bantam all came back. This wasn't corporate manufacturing. This was a barn raising. Probst was living in the factory. He was the chief engineer, the foreman, the quality inspector. He was solving problems that Ford's massive engineering department said were unsolvable. The Army spec said 2,300 pounds. Probst knew his vehicle, with the heavy-duty axles and transfer case, would be closer to 2,000 pounds. He told Bantam, "Build it anyway. Build it strong. If it works, they won't care about the weight." He was breaking the rules again. The Bantam crew was hand-forming the sheet metal. They were welding the frame by hand. This wasn't an assembly line. This was a custom-built hot rod. The Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC-40, started to take shape. It was small. It was square. It had round headlights and a flat grille. It was ugly. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. It was a box on wheels. As the days counted down, 30 days left, 20 days left. Panic set in. The deadline was 5 p.m., September 23rd. The delivery location was Camp Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland. That was 250 miles away by September 21st, with 48 hours to go. The car still wasn't assembled. The engine was in, but the wiring harness was wrong. The custom transfer case from Spicer had arrived, but the mounting brackets didn't fit. Probst and his team had to re-drill the frame on the factory floor. The crew was exhausted. They were making mistakes. They had worked for 40 straight days, many of them sleeping on cots next to the assembly line. On the morning of September 22nd, 36 hours to deadline, they finally started the engine. It worked. They spent the entire day test driving it around the factory yard, fixing leaks, adjusting the brakes, tightening bolts. At 4:15 p.m. on September 22nd, Harold Christ, the factory manager, and Karl Probst climbed into the driver's seat. The paint was still wet. They had less than 25 hours to drive 250 miles on an untested, handmade, impossible vehicle, to meet a deadline that the biggest companies in the world had called a joke. Probst pushed the throttle. The ugly little car rolled out of the Bantam factory. The race was on. The race was on. But this wasn't just a race against the clock. It was a race against physics. The car Karl Probst and Harold Christ were driving wasn't a production model. It was a prototype, a single, handmade collection of parts that had never been driven more than a few miles around a factory yard. And now they had to drive it 250 miles on public highways. The paint was still wet. The welds were still fresh. Every vibration from the road, every rattle from the engine was a potential disaster. What if the transmission, pulled from a Studebaker, couldn't handle the strain? What if the axles, the ones Spicer said weren't designed for this, cracked under the weight? If they broke down on the side of the road in Pennsylvania, the Bantam Company wouldn't just be bankrupt. It would be a joke, a footnote in history about the tiny company that tried to build a miracle car and failed. For 7 hours, Probst and Christ drove in almost complete silence, listening, feeling, praying. The ugly little car just kept going. It hummed past farms, through small towns. People stopped and stared. What was this thing? It looked like a child's toy, a Blitz buggy, as the Bantam mechanics had nicknamed it. They drove through the night. Then, just outside of Harrisburg, it happened. A sound. A loud clank from the front axle, followed by a violent shudder. The steering wheel tore itself from Probst's hands. The car veered hard left across the road and slammed to a stop in a ditch. It was over. They sat in the dark for a minute. Silence. The engine was still ticking. Probst got out with a flashlight. He looked under the car. His heart was pounding. He had pushed the design too hard, taken too many shortcuts. The problem? A universal joint in the steering linkage had failed. A simple 50-cent part. But they didn't have a spare. This was it. They had failed, just miles from the finish line. But Probst wasn't just an engineer. He was a mechanic. He looked at the failed part. He looked at the toolbox in the back. He found a welding torch they had packed, just in case. At 3:01 a.m. on the side of a dark highway, Karl Probst lay on his back in a muddy ditch and welded the steering joint solid. It was a terrible fix, a stupid trick. It meant the car could barely turn left, but it would drive. They climbed back in, covered in mud and grease. They limped the rest of the way to Baltimore at 4:30 p.m. on September 23, 1940, with just 30 minutes to spare. A small, ugly, mud-covered car that was half broken sputtered up to the front gate of Camp Holabird. The Army was waiting, but Bantam wasn't the only one there. Standing on the parade ground in clean suits were the engineers and executives from Ford and Willys Overland. They hadn't come to compete. They had come to watch. They had come to see the bankrupt company fail its impossible deadline. They were corporate spies, invited by the Army itself. The Army Commission, led by Colonel Howlin' Mad Smith, walked out to meet them. The officers looked at the tiny, battered car. Then they looked at Probst and Christ, covered in grease from their roadside repair. The Ford engineers were smirking. This thing was what Bantam had built? The first test was the weigh-in. The Army's impossible spec was 2,300 pounds. Probst knew he had failed this. His car, built strong, weighed in at 2,030 pounds. The Ford executive turned to the Army officer. "It's disqualified," he said. "It's 700 pounds overweight. It failed." This was the moment. The system had won. The rules were the rules. The Bantam crew, exhausted, defeated, stood and waited for the Army to send them home. But the Army officers weren't looking at the scale. They were looking at the car. It was the only car, the only company that had even tried. An officer stepped forward. He ignored the Ford executives. He looked at Karl Probst, and he said, "Start the engine." What happened next at Camp Holabird wasn't a test. It was a revelation. The Army officers, the ones who had seen their motorcycles and trucks fail in the Louisiana mud, had designed a torture chamber for vehicles. First, the mud pit. The Bantam Blitz buggy plunged in. The mud was 3 feet deep. The little engine screamed. The four-wheel drive engaged, and the car crawled its way out the other side. The officers' mouths were open. Next, the hill climb. A 60% gravel slope. No truck, no motorcycle could climb it. The Bantam car hit the base at 20 miles an hour and ran all the way to the top. The Ford engineers stopped smiling. For 30 days, the Army did everything it could to break this stupid little car. They drove it through rivers. They jumped it off loading docks. They ran it over 2x4s. They drove it, full speed, into a brick wall. The Bantam car just kept going. It was tough. It was agile. It could do everything the Army had dreamed of. Karl Probst hadn't just met the impossible specs. He had created a whole new category of vehicle. The ordinary man from the bankrupt company had won. He had saved the Army. He had saved his company. He had delivered the miracle. And then the system struck back. In Washington, the celebration was short-lived. The generals had their miracle car, but now they had a new fatal problem. They didn't just need one car. They needed hundreds of thousands of them, and American Bantam, the tiny bankrupt company that had saved them, was too small. Their factory, even running 24/7, could only build a handful of cars a day. The Army needed an industrial giant. Bantam was awarded the first small contract for 70 cars. It was a token of thanks. But the real prize, the massive war-winning contract, was still on the table, and the Army did something unbelievable. They did something that, in the civilian world, would have been called corporate theft. The Army thanked Karl Probst and American Bantam for their patriotism. And then they asked Probst for his blueprints, the blueprints he had drawn for free, the designs Bantam had paid for in blood and sweat, the soul of their miracle machine. Bantam, desperate to please the Army, handed them over. The very next day, the United States Army took Karl Probst's impossible designs and gave them to Ford and Willys Overland, the two giants who had laughed at the 49-day deadline. The message was clear. This is the car. Now copy it and make it better. This was the ultimate betrayal. The ordinary men at Bantam had proven the concept, broken the rules, and shown the way. Now the system, the corporate giants with their endless factories, were being invited to swoop in and steal the credit. The fight for the Jeep wasn't over. It had just begun. Now it wasn't a race against time. It was a race against power. Willys Overland's engineers tore Probst's design apart. They were brilliant, but they were also arrogant. They saw Probst's design, with its mix-matched parts, as amateur. They decided to build their own version. Their prototype was the Willys Quad. It looked similar, but it had one massive difference: the engine. Willys had a powerful Go Devil engine, far stronger than Bantam's. But their car was heavy, clumsy, and like Bantam's, it was massively overweight. Meanwhile, at Ford, the engineers did what Ford did best. They took the Bantam design and optimized it for mass production. Their car was the Ford Pygmy. It was lighter, and it was the first to have the flat, slotted grille that we now recognize as the Jeep face. By November 1940, the Army had 3 miracle cars: the Bantam BRC-40, the original, the one that had proven it was possible; the Willys Quad, the powerhouse, the one with the superior engine; the Ford Pygmy, the factory, the one designed to be built by the thousands. The Army now faced a choice. They had to pick one design. They lined all 3 cars up at Camp Holabird for a final brutal competition. 4,500 cars would be ordered immediately. The winner would get the contract that would define the war. The 2 losers would be forgotten. Bantam, the ordinary man who had started it all, was now the underdog. Again. They were about to go head-to-head with the 2 biggest corporations on Earth, who were using their own designs against them. The final tests began. It was Bantam versus Willys versus Ford, the fate of the Jeep, and the fate of the tiny company that had sacrificed everything. now hung in the balance. The Army's final decision, a decision that would change history, would erase two of them from history forever. The final tests at Camp Holabird were not a competition. They were an execution. The Bantam BRC-40, the original, was the lightest and most agile. It ran circles around the other two, but it was underpowered. The Ford Pygmy was the most refined. It was quiet. Its stamped metal body, designed by Ford's mass production genius, was cheap and easy to build. And the Willys Quad was a monster. Its Go Devil engine, with 60 horsepower, was a brute. It had 15 more horsepower than the Bantam or the Ford. It could pull more, climb faster, and take more punishment than anything the Army had ever seen. But the car itself was heavy, uncomfortable, and rushed. The Army Commission finished their reports. They had a fatal problem. Again. The best design was Bantam's. The best engine was Willys's. The best production body was Ford's. They couldn't pick one. Every car had a fatal flaw. Bantam was too weak. Ford was too weak. Willys was too heavy. The war in Europe was exploding. Hitler was preparing to invade Russia. The U.S. Army had no time. They couldn't go back and redesign the whole thing. So, in early 1941, the Army did something that wasn't just theft. It was genius. They decided not to pick a winner. They decided to build a Frankenstein. The Army's technical committee, led by a man named Jeep Harrington, effectively took the Bantam BRC-40, the car Karl Probst had drawn for free, tore out its weak engine, and shoved the 60-horsepower Willys Go Devil engine inside. Then, they took the best production ideas from Ford's Pygmy, like the flat, slotted grille and the easier-to-build body, and bolted them onto the Bantam Willys hybrid. This monster was the vehicle they wanted. It was the Willys Model MB. The Jeep was born. But this led to the final heartbreaking betrayal. The Army handed this Frankenstein blueprint, this perfect combination of three companies' work, to Willys Overland. They were given the first massive contract for 16,000 vehicles. And what about Bantam? The ordinary men from Butler? The bankrupt company that had answered the call when no one else would? They had lost. Their design, their 49-day miracle, was now the standard for the entire U.S. military. And another company was being paid to build it. Bantam protested. They appealed to Congress. But war doesn't wait for lawsuits. The Army needed cars, and Willys could build them. Bantam was given a consolation prize, a small contract to build 1/500 of their own BRC-40s, which were now obsolete. It was a slap in the face. Karl Probst, the engineer who had worked for free, saw his impossible car become the Willys Jeep. Soon, even Willys couldn't keep up with the demand. The Army needed millions of Jeeps. So, they turned to the only other company on Earth that could build them that fast: Ford. In a final twist of irony, the Army forced Willys to give the Frankenstein blueprints, the ones Bantam had originated, to their biggest rival, Ford. From 1941 until 1945, two companies, Willys and Ford, built over 640,000 Jeeps. And American Bantam? The ordinary men who started it all? They were given contracts to build trailers. The stupid little trailers the Jeeps would pull. They had been pushed to the sidelines, forgotten by history. Their factory went silent again after the war. This time, forever. The story of the Jeep is not a simple story of victory. It's a brutal story of innovation, sacrifice, and corporate theft. But the story of the men at Bantam was over. The story of their invention was just beginning. This is where the ugly little car stops being a tiny trick and becomes the single most important massive result of the entire war. Other stories. You'll hear about stupid wire tricks that helped a few pilots. You'll hear about fake bodies that fooled a few generals. Those stories are fascinating. This is not one of those stories. The Jeep wasn't a trick. It was the platform. It was the stage on which all other stories of the war were told. When the U.S. sent thousands of planes and tanks to Stalin to save Russia through Lend-Lease, the Russians were grateful. But the Red Army soldiers, they didn't write home about the tanks. They wrote about the willies to the Russian soldier fighting in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. The Jeep was a miracle. It was the only thing that could pull their artillery, the only thing that could rescue their wounded. They called it the Ivan Willies. It was their friend. In the scorching deserts of North Africa, the Jeep became a new kind of weapon. British SAS commandos, the original special forces, took these stupid little American cars, tore them apart, and mounted 50-caliber machine guns on them. They created the first fast attack vehicle. While Rommel's panzers were waiting for fuel, these Jeeps, loaded with gas cans, would drive hundreds of miles around the German lines, appear from the empty desert, shoot up German airfields, and vanish before the panzers even knew they were there. The Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a scalpel. On June 6, 1944, D-Day. What was the first vehicle to drive off the Higgins boats and onto the beaches of Normandy? It was the Jeep, before the tanks could land, before the trucks could move. It was the ugly little car that carried the battlefield commanders, the signal officers, and the combat medics. It was the nervous system of the entire invasion. And in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, when Hitler's panzers made their last desperate gamble, when American soldiers were trapped, freezing in foxholes, surrounded in the snow, what was the only thing that could move? The horse was useless. The motorcycle was a joke. The 2-ton trucks were stuck on the icy roads. The only thing that could drive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes was the Jeep. They became ambulances, racing through artillery fire to rescue the wounded from Bastogne. They became heaters, with soldiers clustering around the engine block just to stay alive. They became machine gun nests, driven right to the front line to stop the German advance. There is a famous report from a captured German officer. His panzers had been stopped by a handful of American paratroopers. He was confused. He said, "I do not understand. We cut your supply lines. We surrounded you. You had no food, no ammunition. How did you keep fighting?" The American major just pointed out the window. "We didn't need the roads. We had those. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a lifeline." This tiny object, born from a bankrupt factory in 49 days, became the most undefeated story of the war. Why? Because it wasn't a secret. It wasn't a one-time trick. It was the opposite. It was everywhere. It was the common, ordinary, reliable workhorse that every single GI, every Brit, every Canadian, every Australian, every Russian, depended on. General George C. Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who lived and died with the common soldiers, wrote, "It did everything. It went everywhere. It was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It consistently carried twice what it was designed for, and still kept going." And General Eisenhower, the man who had watched motorcycles fail in the Louisiana mud, gave the final verdict. He said the 3 tools that won the war for America were the C-47 transport plane, the bazooka, and the Jeep. The ordinary man, Karl Probst, never got rich. American Bantam, the company that had risked it all, vanished into history. But their stupid little car, their ugly prototype, became the machine that liberated a planet. It wasn't a silly story of a one-time trick. It was the story of the single most decisive, revolutionary, and important piece of machinery in the history of human conflict. On December 12, 1939, at 9:04 a.m., a Soviet patrol of 15 men moved through a frozen forest in Finland. The temperature was -40 degrees Celsius. Their heavy wool coats were stiff. Their breath turned to instant ice on their scarves. They were part of the largest army on Earth. the invincible Red Army of Joseph Stalin, and they were here to crush a nation of farmers in a war that was supposed to last 10 days. They were confident. They were loud. Their equipment clanked. They saw no one. They were wrong. The first shot was a whisper, a sharp crack that was instantly eaten by the snow. The man at the back of the patrol simply fell. No explosion. No cry. He was just gone. The lieutenant at the front stopped. He turned. He saw nothing. The second shot came 3 seconds later. The lieutenant's eyes snapped forward just as his radio man, 200 meters ahead, crumpled. This time, the lieutenant thought he heard the bullet. A faint hiss. Just before the impact. Panic. The patrol dove for the snowbanks, but the snow was no cover. It was a kill zone. The shots kept coming. Crack. A man trying to unlimber his machine gun slumped over it. Crack. A sergeant pointing a direction fell backward. Crack. 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 In less than 3 minutes, 12 men were dead. The 3 survivors, terrified, didn't run. They lay frozen in the snow for 4 hours, praying they wouldn't be next. When they finally crawled back to their lines, their report made no sense. There was no muzzle flash. There was no sound of a sniper team. There was no sign of where the shots came from. It was a ghost, a Belaya Smirt, the White Death. What those soldiers didn't know, what the entire Red Army Command was about to learn, was that this ghost was not a supernatural entity. It was a 33-year-old farmer, a man so unassuming, so quiet, he was barely 5 feet 3 inches tall. A man who had just declared a one-man war against an entire empire. And he was doing it with a trick so simple, so counterintuitive, it would change the rules of modern warfare. This is the story of Simo Häyhä and the simple, forgotten modifications that made him the deadliest sniper in human history. To understand how a single farmer could terrorize an army, you first have to understand the war. It was a war that should have been impossible. A true David versus Goliath. In November 1939, Joseph Stalin looked at his neighbor, Finland, and made his demands. He wanted their land, their islands, their military bases. He saw Finland as a buffer zone, a speed bump against a future German invasion. The Finns, led by Marshal Mannerheim, refused. Stalin was enraged. On November 30th, 1939, after staging a false flag operation known as the Shelling of Mainila, the Soviet Union invaded. The numbers were not just a mismatch. They were a joke. The Red Army poured over the border with 1 million soldiers. The Finns? They had 300,000 men, mostly part-time militia. The Soviets brought 6,000 tanks. The Finns had 32. The Soviets commanded 3,000 aircraft. The Finns had 114. The world watched in pity. Time magazine wrote that Finland was doomed. The Red Army's own doctrine, deep battle, was built on overwhelming force. Political commissars told the troops they would be in Helsinki, the Finnish capital, in 2 weeks. They packed their dress uniforms for the victory parade. But they had made the same mistake every invader makes. They looked at the numbers on a map, and not the map itself. They were invading in winter, the deepest winter, and they were invading a country that was 70% forest. The Finns had a word for their national spirit, sisu, a kind of stubborn, courageous grit, a cold determination. They knew they couldn't win a conventional war. They couldn't stop the Red Army, so they wouldn't fight a conventional war. They would not meet the Soviets, tank for tank. They would let the tanks come, channel them onto frozen lakes, and then smash the ice with artillery. They would let the massive divisions crawl down the few narrow forest roads, and then they would cut them off. Finnish ski troops, dressed in white, silent, invisible, would appear from the trees, destroy the field kitchens, kill the officers, and vanish. They called this Matti tactics. They would chop the long, mile-long Soviet columns into smaller, digestible pockets. And then They would let the cold do the real work. The cold was the Finns' greatest ally. -40 degrees. Engines froze. Tank grease turned to concrete. Soviet soldiers, in their inadequate green-brown uniforms, stood out like black dots on white paper. They froze to death by the thousands, often standing up, their rifles frozen to their hands. This was the nightmare the Red Army had walked into. And in the middle of this nightmare, on the front line at the Kola River, was a small, quiet farmer. Simo Heiha was not a career soldier. He was from a town called Rautjärvi, near the new border. He was a farmer and a prize-winning marksman in the local civil guard. When the war started, he was 33 years old. He was assigned to the 34th Infantry Regiment. He looked at the Soviet invaders pouring into his homeland, and he felt that sisu. But he also had a skill. He wasn't just a good shot. He understood the science of shooting in the cold. He understood it better than the engineers who wrote the manuals. When he was issued his rifle, it was a Finnish M28-30, a variant of the old Russian Mosin Nagant. It was reliable, it was accurate, and it had standard iron sights. His commanding officer offered him a new rifle, one with a state-of-the-art Soviet PE-4 scope. Scopes were the future. They let you see the enemy up close. They magnified the target. Every sniper in the Red Army, the German Army, the American Army, they all wanted a scope. Simo Heiha refused it. This was his first illegal modification, his first break from doctrine. To his superiors, it looked like madness. To Simo, it was simple logic. This was his piano wire tensioner. The problem wasn't the rifle. The problem was the cold. Simo knew 3 things that the military sniper schools had not yet learned. First, a scope glints. The glass lens, even if shaded, would catch the low winter sun. A tiny flash of light, visible from 500 meters away. In this white, frozen hell, a single glint meant death. The iron sights of his M28-30, just black metal, no glint, no death. Second, a scope fogs. The extreme cold, combined with the warmth of a human eye pressed against it, would create an instant, opaque fog on the lens. You would raise your rifle, see only white, and have to wipe it, by which time the target was gone. Or worse, the target had seen you. Third, a scope forces you to lift your head. To get a proper sight picture, a sniper had to raise his head higher off the ground than a man using iron sights. A few extra inches. In a flat, snow-covered field, those few inches were the difference between being a hunter and being a target. Simo kept his iron sights. He knew his kill zone was between 150 and 400 meters. He didn't need magnification. He had been shooting pine cones and fox ears on his farm his whole life. He just needed reliability, but that was only his first trick. The others were even simpler, and even more brilliant. The Red Army was learning. Their snipers were hunting for our snipers, and they looked for 2 things. The first was muzzle blast. When a high-powered rifle is fired, it kicks up the snow in front of the barrel. It's a small poof of white. And to a trained counter-sniper, it's a massive shoot here sign. Simo's solution? He didn't just find a spot. He built a position. He would spend an hour packing down the snow in front of his rifle, pouring water on it, and letting it freeze into a solid block of ice. When he fired, the block of ice would absorb the entire muzzle blast. The snow wouldn't move. There was no poof. There was only silence. The second thing they looked for was breath. At -40 degrees, a human's hot breath hangs in the air like a cloud of smoke. A sniper, lying in wait, breathing heavily from tension. He might as well be sending up smoke signals. Simo's solution for this was so simple. It was genius. He kept his mouth full of snow. He would lie in his frozen nest for hours, with a packed ball of snow under his tongue. It cooled his breath inside his body. When he exhaled, the air was already the same temperature as the outside. There was no fog, No cloud, no signal. Think about this. An enemy sniper is looking for Simo. He's scanning the horizon with his high-powered, glinting scope. He's looking for a head raised too high. He's looking for the poof of snow. He's looking for the fog of breath, and Simo Heiha has none of it. He has no scope to glint. His head is lower than the enemy's. His muzzle blast is absorbed by ice. His breath is invisible. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. He had used simple farmer's logic, the logic of a man who lives with the cold, to become a perfect, invisible killing machine. And now, he went to work. His routine was brutal. He would wake before dawn. He'd pack his white bread and sugar. He'd put on his multi-layered white camouflage suit. He'd grab his rifle, his Suomi submachine gun, and his skis, and he would tell his unit, "I'm going hunting." He'd ski, alone, deep into the no-man's land. Often behind the Soviet lines, he'd find his spot, a gentle rise, a fallen log. He'd build his nest. He'd pack the snow. He'd put the snow in his mouth, and he would wait, and wait, and wait. The cold would sink into his bones. Most men would shiver, would move. Shivering ruins a shot. But Simo had sisu. He became part of the snow. He was the winter. Then, a target. A Soviet officer reading a map. 300 meters. Crack. A machine gun team setting up. 250 meters. Crack. Crack. A soldier running for cover. 350 meters. Crack. He never fired twice from the same spot if he could help it. He'd shoot, then use his skis to move 100 meters, find a new spot, and shoot again. The Soviets would blast the old position with artillery, killing nothing but trees, while Simo was already engaging them from their flank. At the end of the day, he'd ski back to his lines. His commanding officer, a Lieutenant Utalainen, would ask him for the count. Simo, a quiet man, would just reply, 5, the next day. 8, the next day. 12. At first, the officers didn't believe it. The numbers were too high. They were impossible. No sniper gets 12 kills in a day. The doctrine said sniping was a slow, patient game of 1 or 2 kills. This was the engineering officer from the P-38 story all over again. The numbers didn't match the manual, so they sent an observer with him. The observer came back at the end of the day, his face pale, shaking. He confirmed every single kill. The farmer wasn't lying. On December 21st, 1939, Simo killed 25 Soviet soldiers. On December 22nd, he killed 23. On Christmas Day, 1939, while the Red Army Command was drinking vodka, Simo Heiha went hunting. His tally for the day, 38 confirmed kills. In a single day. This wasn't war. This was an extermination. The front line at Kola was a meat grinder. The Soviets had 12 divisions, over 160,000 men, trying to break through. The Finns had 4 divisions. The Finns were outnumbered 4-1. The Soviet commander, General Meretskov, threw waves of men at the Finnish lines. They were cut down by machine guns. They were blown up by Mati ambushes. And they were being hunted. By the ghost, morale in the Red Army shattered. It's one thing to be killed by artillery. It's another thing to be killed by an enemy you can see. But to be hunted by something invisible? It broke their minds. Soldiers refused to go on patrol. Officers refused to leave their bunkers. They would light fires for warmth and crack. The man closest to the fire would fall. They would group together for safety. And Simo would use his submachine gun, killing the whole squad. He wasn't just a sniper. He was a psychological weapon. He had single-handedly created a no-go zone, half a mile deep. An entire sector of the front line was paralyzed by one man and his old rifle. This is the moment the story pivots. This is the Saburo Sakai moment from the P-38 script. The problem had become too big for the frontline officers to hide. The reports of a Belaya Smirt went all the way up to the Soviet High Command, to Stavka. Stalin's generals were being humiliated. Their mighty deep battle doctrine, their thousands of tanks and millions of men, were being held at bay by a few thousand Finns on skis, and, according to the terrified reports, by one single unkillable demon. The Red Army could not, would not, tolerate this. The man in the P-38 script, McKenna, was a secret. His modification was hidden. But Simo Häyhä, his modifications were now famous. The Finns started calling him the Magic Shooter. And the Soviets, they just wanted him dead. The order came down from Soviet command. Forget the front line. Forget the strategic objectives. The number one priority in the Kola sector, Satuets, was to find and kill this Finnish farmer. They stopped sending regular patrols. It was a waste of men. Instead, they assembled their best. First, they sent in their own sniper teams. The best of the best from the Moscow Sniper School. Men with brand-new, high-tech scoped rifles. Men who had trained their whole lives for this. Simo hunted them. They would find a spot. Their scope would glint. And Simo, from 400 meters, would put a single iron sight shot right through their scope and through their eye. He killed them one by one. It didn't work. The problem was getting worse. So they escalated. If snipers couldn't kill him, they would use artillery. They started a new tactic. Anytime any soldier was killed by a single shot, the entire sector would be blanketed by heavy mortar and artillery fire. Hundreds of shells fired at one suspected position. Simo was caught in this. One day, his position was hit by over 100 shells. The trees around him were shredded. The ground was turned to black mush. When the barrage lifted, his commanding officer wrote him off as dead. An hour later, Simo walked back to the dugout, covered in dirt, his white uniform torn. He had a few shrapnel wounds. He just nodded to his CO and said, "They were loud today." Then he went back out. The Red Army was now obsessed. They were desperate. This one farmer, this 5'3" ghost, was laughing at their technology, at their numbers, at their power. He had killed their best snipers. He had survived their artillery. They had to try something new. In late February 1940, the Soviet command at Kola assembled a special counter-sniper platoon. Not one man, not a team, a platoon. 30 of their best shooters, supported by machine gunners, given one single mission: hunt the White Death. Do not come back until he is dead. The Red Army, with its millions of men, was now officially hunting one single man. They were no longer trying to win the war. They were trying to win this battle. The hunters had become the hunted. A platoon of elite Soviet killers moved into the forest, looking for one farmer. What they didn't know was that they weren't hunting a man. They were hunting a ghost, and this ghost was about to hunt them back. The platoon moved into the forest just after dawn. 30 of the Red Army's best, supported by Degtyaryov machine guns. They were hunters, given a single target. They moved in tactical formation, scanning the trees, their new SVT-40 scoped rifles glinting in the weak sun. They were looking for a man. Simo Häyhä was looking for targets. He wasn't in the trees. He was buried in a snowdrift 400 meters from their path, his old M2830 resting on a block of ice. He had been waiting for them for 6 hours. He watched them come. He saw their confidence. He saw their scopes glinting. And he saw their heavy, clumsy boots crushing the snow. They were loud. Simo waited. He let the first 10 men pass. He let the machine gun team pass. He aimed for the man at the very back. The platoon's radio man, crack. The sound was gone before the platoon leader even registered it. The radio man fell, a neat hole in his chest. The platoon instantly reacted. They dove for cover. The machine gun team opened up, firing a 50-round drum into the trees where they thought the shot came from. They were wrong. They were shooting at a ghost. While they were firing, Simo was already gone. He didn't run. He skied. Silently, using his white camouflage, he moved 300 meters to their flank, to a pre-prepared position he had built the day before. He waited. The Soviet lieutenant, thinking the sniper had fled, motioned for his men to advance. Cautiously, they moved forward. Crack, the lieutenant fell. This time, the shot came from their left. Panic. The platoon had no leader. And now, no radio. The remaining 28 men were trapped. They didn't know where the next shot would come from. They were being hunted. One by one, they hunkered down as night fell. The temperature dropped to -35. They were cold. They needed a fire. Their training said no. Their survival instinct screamed yes. A small group of 6 men broke formation and huddled together, trying to light a small fire for warmth. It was the last mistake they ever made. Simo was 200 meters away, not with his rifle, but with his other weapon, a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. He emerged from the trees like an apparition and emptied a 71-round drum into the huddle. The firefight was over in 10 seconds. The rest of the platoon, hearing the submachine gun fire from one direction and still terrified of the sniper fire from another, broke. They ran in every direction, into the darkness, into the forest. Simo didn't chase them. He didn't need to. The forest and the cold took them. The next morning, Finnish patrols found 27 bodies. The elite counter-sniper platoon was gone. This was no longer a battle. This was a haunting. The psychological terror the White Death inflicted was now more devastating than the physical damage. We know this, not from Finnish reports, but from the diaries of the Soviet soldiers who faced him. A soldier named Pavel in the 75th Rifle Division wrote a letter to his mother that was recovered months later. "Mother, this is not war. This is hell. We do not fear the Finns. We fear the silence. In our doctrine, silence means peace. Here, silence means he is watching. When the artillery stops, our hearts stop with it. We know he is out there. We know he is looking at us. The silence is the White Death." Pavel wrote about the rules of survival on the Kola front. Rule 1, you never light a fire. The Finns have a saying, "Kola holds, unless the men are ordered to light fires." We know this. We choose to freeze instead. Rule 2, you never run to help a wounded man. When a man cries out, it is a trap. The ghost is watching the body. He is waiting for the medic. He is waiting for a friend. We leave our friends to die, or we die with them. Rule 3, you never group up, but you never walk alone. Both are death. Mother, I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of waiting to die. This was the ripple effect of Simo's small tricks, his refusal of a glinting scope, his ice block to hide his muzzle blast, his mouthful of snow to hide his breath. These weren't just tactics. They were psychological torture. He had systematically removed every sign that a human being was hunting them. He had become an invisible elemental force of the winter itself. He was the cold. He was the silence. He was the White Death. The Soviet command was now in a state of total panic. Their elite snipers had failed. Their counter-sniper platoon had been annihilated. Their artillery barrages had failed. Their frontline soldiers were on the verge of mass mutiny. The entire Kola front, a vital strategic objective, was being held at a standstill, not by the Finnish army, but by the legend of one single farmer. Stalin's generals had one last, desperate option. If you cannot kill the man with precision, you kill everything with brute force. The order was given: grid square removal. The Red Army was no longer aiming at anything. They were going to systematically erase the entire forest, 1 square kilometer at a time. They brought in their heaviest guns, 120mm howitzers, heavy mortars. They stopped waiting for a Finnish attack. They just fired, all day, all night. They turned the pristine white forests of Kola into a black, splintered moonscape. The Finns called it the Kola Holocaust. They were firing tens of thousands of shells a day. Simo Haiha kept hunting. The shelling made it harder, but it also made it easier. The sound of the constant explosions masked the sound of his own rifle. He moved through the craters, a ghost in a shattered landscape. His tally kept climbing. 200, 300, 400. By early March 1940, in less than 100 days, Simo Häyhä's official, confirmed sniper kill count was 505, 505 men. That's an entire battalion, killed by one man with iron sights. And that number doesn't even include the 200-plus men he killed with his Suomi submachine gun. He was, without any doubt, the most effective soldier on Earth. The Finnish High Command recognized this. They promoted him from corporal to second lieutenant. It was the single fastest battlefield promotion in Finland's history. They gave him a custom-made presentation-grade rifle, a Sako M2830, engraved with his name. He was a national hero, and the Red Army just wanted him gone. March 6, 1940, the 100th day of the war. The Soviets were launching their final, desperate, all-out offensive at Kola. Simo was in his position, as he was every day. But this was not a quiet hunt. This was a full-scale battle. He was firing as fast as he could, reloading, firing again. He had already killed several men that morning. The Soviets knew roughly where he was. They had been pounding his sector all morning with mortars. And in the middle of that chaos, a single Soviet soldier, a counter-sniper, got lucky. We will never know his name. We will never know if he was aiming for Simo or if it was just a random shot in a massive battle. But this soldier didn't fire a standard bullet. He fired an explosive round. Simo Häyhä was lining up his next shot, and a single explosive bullet, fired from 300 meters away, hit him directly in the face. The impact was catastrophic. Simo didn't feel pain. He just felt a thump, and then cold. His vision went white. His mouth was suddenly full of hot liquid and broken teeth. He tried to breathe, and he couldn't. The bullet had entered his left cheek and exploded inside his mouth. It shattered his upper and lower jaw, tore off his cheek, and destroyed the entire left side of his face. He fell into the snow, unconscious, bleeding out. His fellow soldiers, who had been fighting nearby, saw him go down. They raced to his position, expecting to find their hero's body. What they found was a nightmare. One soldier said later, half his head was missing. They picked up his body. He was not breathing. There was no pulse. The man who had become a legend, the man who had held back an army, the White Death, was dead. They dragged his body onto a pile of other fallen Finns in the rear, a makeshift morgue. The ghost was finally gone. The war was almost over. The Red Army was finally breaking through. But for Simo Häyhä, a new war, a battle inside his own shattered body, was just beginning. A soldier, passing the pile of bodies, saw a leg twitch. He stopped. He looked closer. The man with the missing face was alive. His name was Simo Häyhä, and he was not dead. He had been found a full week after being shot. He had woken up on the pile of corpses. His jaw was gone. His cheek was gone. But his sisu, his grit, was intact. He was rushed to a field hospital. The war ended just days later, on March 13, 1940. Simo was unconscious for the peace treaty. He was unconscious when the guns finally fell silent on the Kola front, a front that, despite the cost, never broke. The Winter War was over. On paper, Finland had lost. They were forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty. They gave up 11% of their territory. But the Red Army had been humiliated. Stalin's 2-week victory parade had turned into a 105-day nightmare. The invincible Red Army, with its millions of men and thousands of tanks, had been fought to a bloody standstill by a nation of farmers on skis. They suffered over 1 million casualties. They lost over 3,500 tanks and 600 aircraft. And they had been terrorized, paralyzed, and psychologically broken by one man. A 5'3" farmer with an old rifle. This is the real ripple effect. This is the piano wire that changed the entire war. Because Joseph Stalin wasn't the only one watching. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched the Red Army's pathetic failure in Finland. He saw an army that was poorly led, poorly equipped, and terrified of a few ghosts in the snow. The terror that Simo Häyhä had inflicted, the small trick of using iron sights and snow, had helped convince Hitler that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with one hard kick. A year later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Many historians argue that if the Red Army had not looked so weak in Finland, if men like Simo Häyhä had not exposed their every flaw, Hitler might never have dared to invade. The 505 men Simo killed were just the beginning. The fear he created changed history. But while history was changing, Simo Häyhä was in a hospital, fighting his own war. His injuries were so severe, doctors didn't know where to begin. He went through 26 separate agonizing surgeries. They had to rebuild his face from scratch. They took bone from his hip to create a new jaw. They took skin from his thigh to create a new cheek. He was in the hospital for 14 months. He spent years recovering. When he finally emerged, he was a different man. The left side of his face was permanently scarred, disfigured. The White Death now carried the mark of the war on his own face. But he was a hero. Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification remained a secret, Simo's actions were too big to ignore. Marshal Mannerheim himself promoted him and awarded him the Cross of Kola. He tried to rejoin the army when the war with Russia started again in 1941. WW2 continuation war. But he was refused. His injuries were too severe. He was a hero, but one too broken to fight. So, what happens to a man who was the deadliest soldier in the world when the war is over? What happens to the ghost when the snow melts? Simo Häyhä didn't go on a victory tour. He didn't write a best-selling book. He didn't ask for fame. He did what the farmer in him always knew how to do. He went home. He was given a small farm in a new town, since his old one was now in Soviet territory. He spent the next 50 years doing exactly what he did before the war. He bred hunting dogs. He became one of Finland's most successful moose hunters. His skill, his sisu, his understanding of the wild, it never left him. He was a quiet man, a humble man. He rarely spoke of the war. When young reporters would find him, decades later, and ask him how he became the White Death, he'd just shrug. When they asked him if he felt remorse for killing over 500 men, his reply was pure, cold, farmer's logic. He said, "I did what I was told to do, and I did it as well as I could." In 1998, a journalist asked him the secret to his success. What made him so good? Simo, then 92 years old, gave a one-word answer: practice. James McKenna, the mechanic, had his 6-inch piano wire. Simo Häyhä had his iron sights. Both men saw a problem that the experts and the doctrine had missed. The experts saw high-tech scopes. Simo saw a glinting target. The experts saw doctrine. Simo saw snow. The experts saw regulations. Simo saw survival. Simo Häyhä died in 2002 at the age of 96. He was buried in Ruokolahti, a quiet hero in the land he had saved. He remains to this day the deadliest sniper in human history. That's how wars are truly fought. Not always by grand strategies or massive armies, but by the quiet sisu of individuals, by a mechanic in New Guinea who breaks the rules, and by a farmer in Finland who uses the cold itself as a weapon. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.